Okay, hello and welcome to the EPC's election monitor of the Irish elections. My name is Danielle Brady and I'm a senior policy analyst here at the European Policy Centre, and I'm very much looking forward to moderating this afternoon's discussion on the outcomes of the Irish election, which many of you know will know that took place last Friday. Given the PRS-TV system that we have, counting just finished up last night, so we now have a picture of what the composition of the next Irish Parliament, Dáil Éireann, will look like. The election was held amidst a housing and cost of living crisis, and these topics most definitely dominated the debate, and I think we'll touch on that a little bit later during our conversation. Um, the results rendered Fianna Fáil as the largest party with 21.9% of the first preference vote, which means that they have returned 48 seats. Fine Gael had 20.8, I should say, percent of the first preference vote, which will give them, with everything, 38 seats. Sinn Féin then 19%, and they will return 39 seats. Perhaps the biggest loss of the election was the Green Party, who were also in government along with Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, as they've returned just one TD or Member of Parliament compared to 12 the last time around. So in setting up this event, the question that we pose is whether or not the Irish election would buck the trend of the other elections that we've seen across the world in terms of incumbents' success. Would the ruling party lose power, as we've seen demonstrated in other elections most recently, or would they indeed manage to stay in office? So we'll look at that a little bit more closely, look at what the key challenges are ahead when we look towards government formation as we approach those talks in the weeks and potentially months ahead, and also look at what this means at the EU level and in the EU context. So to discuss all this and to answer these questions, I'm delighted to be joined by two fantastic speakers, Brigid Laffan and John O'Brennan. Brigid, of course, is the president here at the European Policy Centre and is Emeritus Professor at the Robert Schuman Centre for Advanced Studies at EUI. And John is the Jean Monnet Chair in European Integration and the Director of the Maynooth Centre for European and Eurasian Studies. So thank you very much for taking the time to join us this afternoon. We'll start with a couple of questions to you both on what happened, on what to expect, and how this will affect the EU. But we'll also want to hear from our audience and those who've joined us this afternoon for your questions as well. So I would invite you to put those questions into the chat box, and you can do that as soon as the questions come to your mind, and we'll pose them to our speakers. So, Brigid, turning to you first, how do you make sense of these results? What are your key takeaways? Were there any surprises for you? And what can we really take from the outcome of the election?
So I would say the first thing to say is that the two large parties, FF and FG, bucked the incumbency trend. The penalty, the incumbency penalty, was entirely found in the performance of the Green Party, which was effectively close to wiped out in terms of parliamentary representation. That's the second time this has happened. They were wiped out in 2011 after the earthquake election of 2011, and again now. So the Green Party suffered very heavily in this election, whereas the two large parties did not. I would say of the two larger parties, Fianna Fáil will be happier because they got an enormous seat bonus. They got 10 seats over FG on just over 1% of the vote. And that's down to the Irish electoral system, whereby second, third, fourth, fifth preferences and the sequence of elimination will determine final seats, either third, fourth, or fifth seats. So there's very often a seat bonus in the Irish system, and this time it went decisively to Fianna Fáil. And one of the reasons for that was Fine Gael had a very significant number of incumbent TDs who did not run. And incumbency helps in the Irish system because name recognition helps. In terms of surprises, for me, the performance of Sinn Féin was not so much a surprise, but remarkable in that at one stage last year they were in the mid-30s in terms of their poll standing. It looked as if that they could make the breakthrough, the decisive breakthrough to government. But not only did they not, but they lost 5.5% of their vote share in this election. And this, for an opposition party, is a very poor performance. And then I think perhaps another surprise was that two of the smaller parties, left-wing parties, Labour and the Social Democrats, did, by their standards, did very well.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's something to take into account. And just building on what you said there in terms of surprises and Sinn Féin perhaps not doing as well as one might have thought last year when they were polling far better than they performed in the election. And coming to you, John, then to see how, looking at as well how well FG and FF did, what is it about Ireland that has created the situation that we defied this incumbency trend? Why have FG and FF managed to stay where they are and look very likely to form the next government? What makes Ireland different perhaps to some of the other countries and states that have held recent elections?
Well, thanks, Danielle. It's a real pleasure to be with you, and thank you for the invitation. Well, I'll start by just mentioning about 3 weeks ago, I had lunch with two ambassadors in Dublin, and they said to me, John, you have the great fortune of having the most boring political system in Europe. And by that, they meant you have this precious thing called stability. And I knew exactly what they were saying, and I think the election outcome kind of confirmed that. I mean, it's very interesting that Ireland, like almost every European jurisdiction now, has a much more fragmented party political system. And yet it doesn't militate against stability.
Mm-hmm.
But for all of that, we should note that the combined vote of Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael has been falling, and that trend was not arrested in this election. Their vote has fallen to a historic low, which kind of mirrors what's going on in many other jurisdictions for centrist parties. But the difference is, I think, that they have been able to enter into stable coalition arrangements, and you could argue actually successful coalitions, not formally after 2016, but after 2020. And despite all the baggage of history, I think they worked pretty well together. And maybe the reason for that is that they are much more alike than they pretend to be. We had this kind of performative thing during the election where they were trying to distinguish themselves from each other. But I think a lot of voters, and I think this is reflected in transfer patterns in particular, were quite prepared to vote for Fianna Fáil if they were Fine Gael, to give their candidates a rather high place on the ballot. And that's hugely important in the Irish system. So we had quite a few Fianna Fáil people being elected because of transfers from Fine Gael, and it worked in reverse as well. Just a couple of other comments, Danielle. One of them is about generational change. Brigid mentioned that a huge number of Fine Gael TDs and former ministers decided not to stand. And that now is reflected in a much younger parliamentary party representation, actually right across the spectrum from Sinn Féin to Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael. There's been a kind of replenishing of talent. And I think that may well invigorate this new parliament when it meets on the 18th of December. I also, as Brigid suggested, think the return of the Labour and Social Democratic parties is very important. They have very, very talented members of parliament. And I think if they decide to go into opposition, and we'll come to that question later of the negotiations, but if they do, I think they could prove a more effective opposition potentially than Sinn Féin. There will be points of intersection, of course, but I think they could be very effective. And they're facing a very important question about whether to go into government or not. Now, a lot of that depends on the numbers. As you said, Fianna Fáil has 48. Fine Gael comes back with 38. So they're
38.
just short of the majority they need. And the choice they have to make now is whether they want to be supported for the next 5 years by up to maybe half dozen independents, or do they pursue a coalition with either Labour or the Social Democrats? I don't know how that's going to unfold, but certainly I think that the fact that we have a much younger and I think potentially vigorous Dáil is actually a healthy thing for our democracy. And finally, just on the Green Party, it's been a regular thing in Irish politics. Brigid mentioned what happened to them previously, but that has also happened to Labour when they went into government, and at an earlier point, the Progressive Democrats. It's somehow strange in the Irish system. It's the small party, often referred to colloquially as the mudguard of the two largest parties, that pay the price for the implementation of policy or unsuccessful outcomes in some areas. Now, I think the Greens were punished because they were actually really successful at having their policy agenda incorporated in government. And it is kind of remarkable that over the last almost 5 years, this coalition government actually worked very well together. In contrast, say, to the German coalition, where with three parties, it's been much more difficult to keep that arrangement in place. And eventually, of course, it collapsed. Now, the Green Party, because it takes climate change very seriously, I think has been punished because there's a perception that they just weren't paying attention to the costs imposed related to climate change. And one of the things I worry about a new government that doesn't have one of the left parties in it is that Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael will just take their foot off the accelerator where climate adaptation is concerned. And we're already behind in our obligations and facing some significant fines by 2030. So the absence of the Green Party, I think, will be really felt on climate in particular.
Maybe on that point, Brigid, just coming to you as well, if you agree with that assessment that the Greens' performance was perhaps related to how they performed in government over the last 5 years, and what that means, if that is the case, what that means then in terms of the public's perception with regards to climate policy, and what sort of challenges then we have in the road ahead in meeting some of those targets outlined by John.
So I would read the electorate on climate in the following way, that the electorate by and large understands that there is a climate crisis, that there needs to be very significant change and transformation, but they don't like it when it happens. And I also think, and here is where, so I think the Green Party was very effective on both climate and I would also say environmental, in terms of more cycling paths, etc., etc. But I think at times they were a bit tone deaf to pursuing things that annoyed people. So the Greens did really badly in rural Ireland because they one of their policies that they didn't like was ribbon development, but that translated into, in Irish society, into you can't build a house on your own land. And it's very difficult in Ireland to sustain a policy where you can't build a house on your own land. And I also noted, I was listening to people just for the 4 weeks leading up to the election, and a lot of complaints about cycle lanes that made driving more difficult, etc., etc. So they may have suffered a little, not just from the big climate, but also what I would call the kind of busybodiness. They might have toned down the busybodiness a bit. There was sometimes a sense almost of maybe a hint of too much righteousness. In other words, it wasn't just the policies, but also niggles that were created. So it wasn't just the big climate justice issues, in my view, in terms of the reaction. to the Green Party, because they did really badly in rural Ireland, but they also did really badly in urban Ireland. I mean, and these were very well performing ministers who lost their seats. But more generally on climate, I mean, Ireland is, say, our target is to reduce emissions by 51% by 2030. We'll probably come in at 29. Now, I do think that the international obligations the Irish state faces will mean that they can't ignore climate in the programme for government, but it won't have that relentless drive that it had when you had Green Party ministers at cabinet. I think the Labour Party has a very strong emphasis on climate in their agenda, in their programme for government, and equally Social Democrats less so. They were more on redistribution and disability. So I do think one of the things to watch out for very carefully in the programme for government is what is in there on climate environment. It will be a good test of what's to come over the 5 years.
That'll definitely be something to watch with regards to the negotiations as well. And I think on Labour, actually, Friends of the Earth potentially did a scorecard, and Labour scored higher than the Greens in terms of what was included in their manifesto. So also interesting to note perhaps that it's not only the Green Party that are really pushing these green and climate policies. But that brings me to the next part, and you've both alluded to it as well with regards to government formation. As it stands, and the numbers would point that it will be a Fianna Fáil Fine Gael government of some sorts. The numbers are not there for it just to be the two. Different ideas that are floating around is that perhaps it will be propped up with some independents, or will it be Labour, Social Democrats? So John, turning to you first of all, to understand what happens next, and what are your views on what that could look like, and indeed how long it might take, dare I ask?
Well, firstly, the Dáil will convene on the 18th of December. And the first task they will face is to elect a new speaker, a Ceann Comhairle. And that person will very likely come from the opposition benches. But the talks themselves, I expect that the 2020 model will be comparable. So this could take 3 months, and we will probably not have a new government in place until maybe the end of January. It could be even later than that, the end of February. The numbers are important, the final seat numbers, because amongst other things, they pose this question about the rotating prime ministership, or Taoiseach's office. Last time around, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael were much closer in terms of final seat distribution, and they ended up with, for Ireland, a very novel arrangement with this split of the job of Taoiseach between Leo Varadkar and later Simon Harris and Micheál Martin. Now that Fianna Fáil have established real distance with Fine Gael, there is a question about whether they will be willing to countenance another rotating Taoiseach model. And I think that's going to be a big part of the negotiations between the two big parties. And if Fianna Fáil agree to it, they might, for example, argue that they deserve more senior ministries. So how are those ministries going to be distributed? I think that question is linked very closely to the one of rotating Taoiseach. And although the gap is 10 seats, and Fianna Fáil is in a much better position because of that numerical advantage they have, I still expect that we could end up with another rotating Taoiseach model for the next 5 years. Because if you're the Fine Gael leadership right now, and you're going to Fianna Fáil, my colleague Gary Murphy made this point on television the other night, and I think he's absolutely right. If Micheál Martin is saying, no, we are not willing to do what we did last time around because we have a much larger number of seats. Now we want the office of Taoiseach for ourselves for 5 years. Well, Fine Gael might well be minded to say, okay, go away and negotiate with Sinn Féin, because we're not going to agree to this. So I think that will be a really important matter in the negotiation. I suspect they will end up with another model of the rotating leadership for 5 years. And the price Fine Gael might have to pay for that is maybe less senior ministers than they might otherwise have. Now, I'm assuming in all of this that they're going to opt for support from independents. So they'll want 5 or 6 reliable independents who they can, to put it crudely, buy off with constituency goodies. Lots of money in the exchequer, that won't be an issue. Stability, I think, would be very important. And I think that would be the preference of Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael over negotiating and potentially bringing into government either the Labour Party or the Social Democrats. And if it's one of the two, I think the strong preference on both the part of Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael would be Labour, partly because they've both worked with the Labour Party before. I think there's a kind of greater familiarity and greater trust. And I think some of them have the view that the Social Democrats are a bit unpredictable in some policy areas. And in housing, for example, one of my colleagues at Maynooth has been elected in one of the Dublin constituencies. He's been a vocal opponent of both Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael housing policy. So I can imagine a situation where the Social Democrats would find it very difficult to come to an arrangement on housing in the programme for government. So I think it's much more likely it's going to be 5, 6 or 7 independents and Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael, with another bout of the rotating Taoiseach model.
Brigid,
So
with you?
I agree entirely with John. I think there will be rotation. I see no circumstances in which FG would go into government without it, but they will sacrifice the ministerial numbers for the rotating Taoiseach. And the reason, I think, is that Simon Harris would want to consolidate his power as leader of FG, and he's unlikely to do that unless he's Taoiseach. Can I also say that I think there's a real dilemma for both Labour and the Social Democrats, because they're very strong policy preferences. But if you're not in power, you get nothing. And they will have to go back to the electorate. And I think this would be a stable government. So we're talking about 2029, end of the decade, broadly, before they would. And they come back to the electorate having been in opposition. So I think there is that dilemma for them. I don't think either of them, in fact, would be that comfortable going in, because they know their bargaining power is weak. It's very weak. They're not needed enough. The Greens were absolutely necessary to the formation of the last government. Neither Labour or the Soc Dems are. But there is a tendency, and I'm thinking here more of another small Irish party called People Before Profit, that they're more comfortable in opposition. But if you're only comfortable in opposition, you're destined to be a tiny party. And I think that also coming into the next election, Sinn Féin will make a big push to put distance between themselves and either of the other two big parties. And that means their competition with Labour and the Soc Dems will actually be acute in the next election. So I think I understand why the two small parties might not be tempted, but it doesn't give, I'm not sure what it does for them in terms of party competition in the future. And then I think, I think it's more than likely, I would say 90%, it will be a government supported by 6 or 7 so-called gene pool independents who will look for something for their own constituency, which is very easy to deliver, can be costed very easily, and does not rely on the big policy differences between the smaller parties and FG and FF. But I do think it then means that in the next in the Dáil, there will be a much sharper divide between government and opposition next time round in this parliament. And it'll be very interesting to see how the dynamics across the left, how that evolves over the next 5 years. I also agree with, I mean, the evidence is there that the two traditional parties have they've lost vote share successively, but there also is probably a level below which this does not go, because they're also very representative of a society. I mean, even though Ireland has real challenges, it's almost full employment, it's a growing economy, and the public finances are very strong, at least for now, barring a major Trump shock. So we shouldn't overestimate the level of dissension in the Irish electorate. There are a lot of, and it tends to also be intergenerational. The older you are in Ireland, the more comfortable you are, etc., etc. So I'm not sure what I'm thinking more in terms of the next election. It'll be a really interesting election because there will have been rotating Taoiseach for two passes, etc., etc. And so the question is, when and how can Sinn Féin make a breakthrough?
That's a very good question, something we might go to, but I'm just looking at a question that has come in here and sort of linking to what you're saying about the state of Ireland in terms of full employment and a growing economy and all of these things. So, but the question that is posed here is about the dimension of the far right in contrast to other EU countries. And building on what John said earlier, this person has asked, is this as a result of the boringness of the Irish political system, or are we simply late to the party? So picking up on that, if we haven't seen what we've seen in other European countries, one could argue the conditions are there in terms of housing crisis and cost of living crisis, but why have we not seen it emulated in Ireland in the same way that it has happened in other European countries and across the world more broadly, of course?
Well, it's very clear Ireland is an outlier now in European terms. Our parliamentary election was sandwiched between the two rounds of the Romanian presidential election. So people will recall last week, there was great shock in Romania and around Europe after this far-right candidate, Mr. Georgescu, came first in that poll. And this hadn't been predicted at all in any of the opinion polls. Now, it's an open question about whether he will manage to win the second round. There's also litigation ongoing in relation to the first round. We had the Romanian parliamentary election again at the weekend. But what it emphasized again, I think, is just how different Ireland is. I think many of us were worried, Danielle, after the local and European elections, that those elections, remember, did see a minor breakthrough for far-right candidates. So some of them were elected to local councils in Dublin and elsewhere for the very first time. Now, quite a few of those candidates ran again, and I have no doubt that part of the reason Sinn Féin had a really poor election in May, June was that these people ate into Sinn Féin's vote, and immigration was a big part of that in the earlier election. But the general election was entirely different. And that's one of the reasons Sinn Féin was able to recover ground significantly, I think. But if you look at the performance of those candidates of the far right, they average less than 1% of the vote in the different constituencies. In fact, the largest vote that they got was a candidate who got 3.5% in one of the Dublin constituencies. So there's a really interesting question about why, even in a very inflamed context over the last year. Remember, we're just a year on from those riots in Dublin. We had never seen anything like this in the entire history of the state. And yet the far right dog just did not bark in this election. I'm puzzled about it because I thought there was scope there for an advance to be made, but whatever the reasons for it, I think most of us are very happy to be an outlier, to continue to be a parliament where there is virtually no representation for those extreme populist positions. Brigid might have more of a sense of why Ireland is different, but whatever the reasons, it remains different, and that's something I think we should be proud of.
Most definitely a good sign that we remain an outlier on this. Brigid, have you more of a sense of why this is the case, sir?
So I would say that immigration remains what I would call a latent issue for the electorate. I don't think we can read from the election, even though I'm very happy at the outcome in terms of the really dismal performance of anyone who could be defined as radical right. It was really dismal. And I think this is a very good and very healthy thing for the society, given that we've become a country of immigration in very significant numbers in a very short space of time. But I think about 6% of the electorate in the exit poll talked of immigration as being their key issue. I think it's latent, and it will remain latent provided that incumbent government, provided the other parties don't start to mobilize this as an issue, and they don't. Irish political parties across the range have been remarkably responsible when it comes to this issue. No dog whistling, no mobilization of the issue. And I don't expect that to change. And I think that's one of the most important things, the fact that it hasn't been mobilized as used in party competition. But I would say it remains latent and is connected, in my view, both to housing and services. That Ireland's population is growing significantly, and we don't yet have the infrastructure or the housing to manage that growth. And when I say infrastructure, it right across the range of public transport, of services, etc., etc. So I think we will remain relatively immune for now, but it does require the next government to deliver. And one of the paradoxes is the two main parties were in power, and I think it's something the electorate doesn't entirely blame them for the non-delivery on services and on housing, in the sense that the majority of the electorate probably feel that the government is trying hard, but that the issues relate more to planning, bureaucracy, land use, land zoning, etc., etc. But I do think this government, so I'm not involved, I have no access, no input, but if I were giving any piece of advice, it would be pick 3 or 4 top issues to deliver, and if necessary, create task forces to make sure that you mobilize the state capacity to deliver.
And Brigid, what for you would be or should be those 3 or 4 issues?
Oh, well, housing is self-evident.
Of course.
And housing there is an ideological conflict here, and that is between public provision of social housing and home ownership. And home ownership is deeply loved by Irish society.
Yes.
I think we need much more public provision of housing. We shouldn't, there is a desire to maybe perhaps have rent control because rents are very high, but rent control will destroy the rental market. So it just doesn't work. But provision of adequate rental, provision of apartments that families can live in, not just houses. So the whole housing and urban, living in urban Ireland. I would say on public transport, absolutely vital. health provision, making sure that there are doctors available in different parts of the country, etc., etc. And then, interestingly, of all of the groups of Irish society that emerged as an identifiable issue in the election were the disabled. And disability covers both mental and physical.
Yes.
Very wide-ranging. And Ireland moved about 10 years ago from having specific supports for specific conditions to the HSE moved to having teams that dealt with all disabilities. But disability is such a broad and complex area that in fact services have deteriorated in Ireland. And that should not have happened at a time when we're spending much more money. So this is not a money issue. So I would say disability, public infrastructure and public transport and housing. And the question is not can they be solved, but rather can the government demonstrate that there is real progress?
John, would you agree with those areas as being areas of priorities for the next government, or is there other areas that you also think need?
No, absolutely. Those are the key ones, I think. I would just add water to the infrastructure because that's particularly important to continued foreign direct investment. And we really have run into a problem here. And it's really a problem of development. The fact that, again, we are an outlier in Europe because the population has doubled between 1990 and today. 20% of the population was born outside of the country. But the big issue in delivering housing and other big infrastructure is where are the workers going to come from? And part of this is related to the high cost of housing and rents, but it's also that there's a finite number of workers in Europe potentially who could be attracted to come and work on these big projects, whether they're public infrastructure projects or private construction industry. We have full employment, and one of the really big tasks for the government, I think, in the years to come is about how you increase recruitment. And it's also a really big issue, by the way, in healthcare, because most of the doctors, certainly in my area and many others, are not taking any more patients because they are full to capacity and they just can't deliver those services. Now, we are opening more medical schools and creating more places and things like that. But these are actually good problems to have in a sense because they are about development. And there is a huge amount of cash in the exchequer. Everybody will have seen the problems that are occurring in France, where Michel Barnier, his government is hanging on by a sliver because they're trying to do a 60 billion euro adjustment in respect of the 20% tax increases, 40% reduction in spending. Well, we've got a surplus this year, much smaller country, of probably 24 to 25 billion, which includes the 14 billion euros from Apple. But nevertheless, if you actually add up all of the surpluses that the exchequer will accumulate up to about 2027, they come to about 60 billion euros. So even at the height of the Celtic Tiger, we never had this amount of cash available to governments to spend. But the really big problem they have is capacity issues and recruitment. And that's going to be a big challenge for the next government.
And I think of course, what we haven't talked about is the potential for very serious geopolitical shocks.
Yes.
That will burst the bubble of Ireland's model of political economy. And interestingly, John, I think the government would probably want to be in place by the 20th of January. Ideally, they would want a functioning Irish government by the Trump inauguration. And there are two sides to this. Ireland obviously is very attractive to US multinational investment, but therefore very vulnerable to any to Trump tariffs. But equally, Ireland is the 5th largest investor in the United States. So there's a lot at stake in terms of what kind of policies Trump will pursue. Will they be one-offs? Will they be consistent? Will it be deglobalization of a very serious kind, decoupling of a very serious kind? In which case, Ireland is the poster child in Europe of globalization. And it's not clear to me how Ireland would deal with it. Would obviously, if it's trade, deal with it via the EU. But we are very vulnerable to a Trump shock. And we're also, in my view, very vulnerable to a significant further deterioration in security and defense in Europe. We're very vulnerable.
Maybe coming to that topic as well, and placing the next government in the context of Europe, and particularly on topics such as security and defence. We've used the word outlier quite a bit today. I think also when we look at Ireland's role when it comes to defence and security at the EU level, we are also an outlier here. But where do you see the government's role in the EU as also we approach a new mandate in Brussels as well? How do you see any changes happening there broadly, or in particular policy areas? Maybe John, coming to you first.
Well, firstly, we're fortunate that we have 2 political parties that are very committed to European integration. So there's going to be much, much more continuity than change. Oh, I absolutely agree with Brigid. There is immense fear in Dublin about what Trump 2.0 actually portends for EU-US relations and for Ireland. I think we're in a deeply, deeply uncomfortable position because the model favoured by our political leaders of different parties over the last 40 years or so is coming under pressure like never before. So we have been, in my view, one of the biggest winners from the single market project. 31 years in existence now. Kind of ironic because in the 1980s, Irish governments were very hesitant to embrace the single market. But when we did, we became this very attractive place for American multinational capital in particular to invest in because they can sell into European markets without any barriers to trade. Now that model is coming under pressure, and the whole single market program itself, because of the giant subsidies that the United States has been offering under Biden, by the way, as well as China, what it's doing in electric vehicles and other areas. And although the single market model was eased during COVID for very good reasons, and state aid again was being used by some governments, that's not a model that Ireland favours or can really compete with. If we've got a German government that's prepared to offer 10 billion to a giant American corporation to invest in a new semiconductor plant, we just can't do that because we cannot compete at that level and that scale. So it is potentially very uncomfortable. A world where we return to economic nationalism for a country that's one of the most globalized in the world. All the relevant indices show that. It's going to be very, very bumpy indeed. And because Trump and some of the key people around him keep identifying Ireland as part of the problem, one of the big questions is, how will his relationship with corporate America evolve? Now, I'm not convinced that he's going to take them on because he is, I think, a kind of creature that is very much part of that world. The tax cuts that he is going to put in place, I think, inevitably will benefit the richest corporations and so on. Now, key question, will he follow through on his threat to penalize American companies that are based in Ireland and sell into the American market, whether they're pharmaceutical companies or tech companies or whatever? And again, I'm not convinced that it's going to be as bad as some people suggest. I understand the trepidation, But I don't think he's going to get into that kind of almost existential battle with US corporations. I think he has always wanted to be top dog in the corporate world. In New York, when he was a property developer, he was considered a kind of joke. And that's, I think, one of the things that has formed his kind of political psychology. But if you look at his relationship with Elon Musk and others, I think he craves the support and approval of corporate America. And that suggests to me, and I don't know if Brigid has a different view, that for all of his obsession with tariffs, he might actually not be as aggressive towards those corporations that have invested here as is sometimes suggested.
So I agree with that, John. But of course, investment hates uncertainty. And
Yes.
what the problem with Trump is not just what he might do, but it's also the contingency and uncertainty that he has created. And he's very unpredictable and transactional. So a Trump presidency 2.0 is by definition one that's difficult to predict. And so you always have to, governments will have to, European governments and the Commission will have to constantly work through the what might, which in and of itself is problematic. But on the other hand, I think we should also not underestimate Europe's agency and capacity to deal with Trump too.
Yeah.
But apart from the political economy issues, the issue that did not raise its head during the election was hardening of geopolitics, conflict, and war.
Yeah.
The Irish election was conducted as if we were in a very peaceful, stable international system, both globally and in Europe. While, we don't know what's happening and will happen in Syria. It's the eastern half of the continent in terms of Moldova, Georgia, and Ukraine, very problematic. And the Irish electorate paid absolutely no attention. And the one Irish parliamentarian, Cathal Berry, who was a former Irish Army Ranger, and in my view was one of probably less than 5 people in the entire Irish Parliament who had a knowledge of security and defence, lost his seat. And he was a very effective parliamentarian.
Yeah.
So I do think that the other area that is not an electoral issue, but is an issue of state security, is when do we get to the stage in Ireland that we take security and defence seriously? And what does that mean for the Irish Navy, air capacity, and land army? We're nowhere close either to spending enough. We don't have enough numbers in the armed forces at the moment. We're way off drone technology and all of the high-tech modern. We're very vulnerable to cyber, and we have 4 interconnectors for energy. So on all of those areas, what hard state security, the Irish debate is almost non-existent. John and I would be routinely called warmongers when we try to even tentatively raise the issue in the public arena. And I think no Irish government can ignore it in the next cycle.
But do you think, okay, we have a continuation of much of what we had in the last government. Do you think there will be a change in the approach? Will it form any part of the negotiations at all?
I find it really interesting that Ireland has not had a Minister for Defence with only one portfolio for a very long time.
Yeah.
And combining defence and foreign affairs is not effective because the minister simply can't do it. No minister could do it. So one thing I would look for in the next government is a separate Minister for Defence, and someone who has the knowledge and strength to go into what is a very traditional Department of Defence and really get things moving. Will it happen? I suspect things will improve, but we're way off where we should be.
But I think a lot also will depend, obviously, on what the US administration does. Now, there's a lot of speculation about whether Trump will try to take the United States out of NATO. I mean, he's on record as talking about Europe in the most derogatory terms. He doesn't have to take the US out of NATO, by the way. He can just make Article 5 inoperable. That is the mutual security clause. And if he does that, it will be as big a shock to the system in Europe as the Russian invasion of Ukraine in early 2022. Now, there have been important developments. We have a new commission with the first ever commissioner for defense and space, the former Prime Minister of Lithuania. The EU is in the process of redirecting unspent money from the 2021 to 27 budget and money unspent in the Next Generation EU fund, potentially into security and defense. That's a very good thing. If you look at the recommendations in Mario Draghi's very important report, those in relation to developing a defense industrial capacity, von der Leyen, interestingly, last week when she introduced her new commission, she spent a lot of time talking about security and defense in a way that no commission president had ever done before. And that, I think, reflects the urgency of the situation. But that urgency will change again if Trump goes to that extreme of taking the United States out of NATO or withdrawing sufficiently. And that includes, by the way, withdrawing support for Ukraine. Imagine a scenario where Ukraine is forced to surrender. The Russians then turn their attention to the Baltic states on the assumption that Trump is not going to intervene under any circumstances. So there's a whole sequencing there of things. Inevitably, Ireland is going to have to respond. I've said for many years, there are no circumstances in which the European Union could survive if one of the Baltic states were to be attacked and we failed collectively to come to their aid. And it wouldn't be enough, in my view, for Ireland to say, well, we will take your refugees, we will give you some financial support and non-military aid. We would have to be part of the collective effort to defend the European Union. And that's the debate that we might be forced to have if the worst comes to the worst and Trump does effectively disable the NATO security architecture as it has existed since 1949.
Perhaps that potentially is the debate we will have to have, but the thing is, perhaps we should already be having this debate more prominently instead of just reacting to a situation when, if it occurs, rather than this now. So I think it's something that we need to focus on, and hopefully we'll see something in the forthcoming government. I want to turn now to some questions that we have from the audience. And we have a question here from John Palmer related to the state of opinion in Northern Ireland and how the renewal of the coalition in Dublin will affect the prospects for a more structured consultation of opinion, north and south, designed to lead a gradual evolution towards unification. Brigid, I don't know what your thoughts are towards that.
Good afternoon, John. I think what we will see is Micheál Martin will be Taoiseach. There's no doubt about that. If it's rotating, he will be number one. And he started in the department of the Taoiseach, the Shared Island Initiative, which is a very, very far-seeing, in my view, but also very comprehensive approach towards North-South relations. It involves the Irish state investing in Northern Ireland, including in infrastructure. It involves lots of partnerships with community groups and all sorts of, also research on public opinion. There is also the forthcoming consent vote within Stormont on the Windsor framework. That has to happen before Christmas. It will be passed. It's a simple majority, but it's very likely, I would say almost certain, that all unionist parties will vote against. So in other words, Brexit will continue to be a wedge issue in Northern Ireland. The Windsor Framework will continue to be a wedge issue for relations between the two communities. And so none of that is good. The contingency within Northern Ireland brought about by Brexit has not been good for Northern Ireland or for, in fact, relations north-south. But on the other hand, for the first time in a very long time, Dublin-London relations are much better, much warmer, and they are establishing a program of joint work, which is a very, very, very good thing. On Irish unification, I see no prospect of a border poll anytime soon. And I think despite the fact that Sinn Féin is the largest party in Northern Ireland and would aspire to be the largest party in the Republic, I'm not sure. Northern Ireland did not feature in the Irish in the election as an issue. And I think public opinion tells us that there is a commitment to Irish unification in the Republic, but when it comes to the nuts and bolts of what that would mean and paying for it, I think opinion is much more varied. So I don't think that Irish unification is a live political issue on the island of Ireland, despite Sinn Féin.
John, would you agree with that?
Yes, for sure. And just to support what Brigid was saying about the Shared Island program, it's very much Micheál Martin's baby. Deeply committed to it. I was one of the principal investigators in a project under the rubric of the North-South Research Framework. And we actually met last week in Croke Park to kind of reflect on what the projects had achieved. And it was extraordinary. They had invested 50 million euros on this. And in many instances, it was the first time that universities and academics in the Republic had actually collaborated with partners in Northern Ireland, Ulster University, Queen's, and others. Micheál Martin is deeply committed to this. And I also think it's probably a good thing that he is seen as a non-conflictual figure by many in the unionist community. Like, it was very interesting during Brexit that ironically, Fine Gael became more identified with unification and with nationalism than Fianna Fáil, which had been, of course, the traditional Republican Party. So I think in Northern Ireland, Micheál Martin's return will be seen as a positive thing. And I absolutely agree with Brigid. There is just no sense in which during this parliament unification will be on the agenda. And actually, even if Sinn Féin were the largest party in forming a government, I think they're terrified at the prospect of a premature border poll because they're not confident they could win it on either side of the border. So it isn't going to happen over the next 5 years. Obviously, we have to allow for contingency, especially in the way that Brigid described on Brexit, but I really don't see any major change except the kind of very positive functional integration that's associated with investment by the British government in Northern Ireland, investment by the Irish government in Northern Ireland, and by the European Union as well. And just one final point to make, because Northern Ireland is still part of the customs union for goods, it's very likely that we'll have evidence by the end of this decade of just how much better off Northern Ireland is because it's part of both the European Union customs union and the United Kingdom economic zone. I think we're already seeing evidence that it's paying dividends in terms of investment and in other things. And it'll be very interesting to see what that means by 2029, 2030.
Well, I think there's lots that will happen between now and 2029, 2030. Hopefully a full term of an Irish government as well, which we'll see in the weeks and months ahead. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, but thank you both to Brigid and to John for your insights this afternoon, which I've very much enjoyed. And thank you very much to all of our participants as well who have joined us this afternoon. So that just leaves me to say goodbye and have a nice rest of the afternoon.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Danielle.
Bye
Thanks
now.
so much. Thank you.